what are your thoughts, guys, on how a local regional business can not survive but thrive right now versus how can a national or international brand thrive? So we're looking for not survive but thrive both on a local and national or international level.
Let me take that one first, just because when you sent these questions over, that was my soapbox question. I'm absolutely infuriated with the way both the U.S. and Canadian governments are dealing with stimulus. I jokingly, only half jokingly, refer to them as the Amazon and Walmart stimulus packages, because we've got federal governments issuing stimulus checks to everybody to encourage them to shop, and then have mandated the closure of every store except for Amazon and Walmart, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. Those are the two brands that need it the least. And this idea that they're selling essential services is bullcrap. You can get boogie boards and board games at either of those. I'm not going into my Walmart to get my toilet paper and bananas. I'm getting stuff to keep my kids entertained, which I consider an essential service at the Neeland household, but not something that any store, and I think frankly small business owners could have been far more creative at finding ways to ensure their shoppers are safe, as opposed to the curbside pickup and some of the more bureaucratic things that are happening inside the big box chains. So I'm actually very worried for the small business owner, not because of their ingenuity or relevance, but because of the government's myopic focus of keeping them out of business right now, as opposed to allowing them the agency to determine what is required for the health and safety of their staff and for their customer base. So until we get more vocal, and I think the Americans just by nature are more accustomed to pushing back on their political leaders than the Canadians are, we're just way too accommodating. We're sheep following the leaders saying, oh, you don't want us to go? That's okay. And I don't think we have to pull Elon Musk's and go apeshit on everybody and threaten to pull our factories out of the state if the government doesn't let us open. But to shutter everything for 4 to 6 weeks while we figure out what we're dealing with was difficult, but not reckless. Keeping us closed for the next 1 to 3 months while you selectively get to decide who's open for business and who isn't open for business, and that's largely based on the national footprint that these retailers have or these restaurants have, et cetera, I think is going to result in lawsuits and is a major encroachment on our free enterprise and even the principles of a capitalistic society. So I think that the big guys are going to continue to get rich, and I think that the little guys are going to be disproportionately disadvantaged, not because of the pandemic, but because of the government intermediation. Thank you. Neeland out.
I love it. And now with 40% of our participants now gone, we'll give it over to you. I'm just kidding. Matt or Leland?
Go, Matt.
Sure. So I think, the question was that you initially asked was what was the?
Yeah, it was, what are your thoughts on how local businesses can thrive right now versus how does that differ from how national or international brands would thrive? So the paradox between the sizes there.
Yeah, well, so I think that, what was already said was true. There are some things that are just against some businesses, period. And I think that, the reality is there's going to be red zone businesses and sort of amber, yellow zone businesses and green businesses. I mean, there'll be some that thrive environments like this and they'll go back to being yellow when it's over. And others will be yellow and go to green, and some in red are just not going to recover whatsoever. There are some things that you just cannot control. I mean, look, there's sites like, there's a local escape, when you take your kids to an escape room kind of game thing locally here in Toronto, and they're pretty smart. People couldn't come to it anymore. And so they created a mobile escape program where they literally mailed you a letter at home that people subscribe to keep the kids busy, which was pretty innovative. There's always a way to kind of pivot and use creativity, get yourself out of it. But the reality is, will this really actually save the business. We don't know. You may need to change completely the model that you're in if you're an entirely red zone business. The way I like to look at it is this: is I think history does repeat itself. I do think that there's nothing like this that's really happened before in this capacity. However, there have been crises, there have been recessions, there have been depressions. And if we can look at things at a macro level, you can kind of understand where you need to go. I always like to use an analogy of like Wayne Gretzky. You know, his father taught him how to be a great hockey player by teaching him how to skate to where the puck is going, not where the puck is. And so, like anything, there's these concepts or principles that's called like pression and lag. And it's just the easiest way to understand it is if you throw a rock into like water and it goes plop, and then you kind of have this ripple effect that goes out. That's the lag. The pressure was the thing that came down. Well, you can like look at it this way, like what's going to happen next at a macro level and will affect businesses at a macro level and businesses at a micro level. And so we had like COVID that triggered off like obviously like unemployment, right? And then that triggered off stimulus. And then the stimulus is probably not going to work, which is going to eventually lead to more unemployment and defaults or insolvencies. And you kind of have to figure out like where is this going? And that's going to obviously affect on how people are thinking and feel about things and the things that are important to people at the time, right? Like, and if we can look at things at that level, and I like to look at things at a level at a 10,000 foot view and then drill into a micro level, we can then kind of figure out what is it that we need to do for our macro businesses, our international businesses, as well as our little tiny small local business. And so that's what I would suggest that people need to do first is figure out where that puck is going for you. And everybody's got a different idea. Some people think it's a V-shaped recovery. Some people think it's going to be U-shape, L-shape, the W, but you got to figure out what is going on here and how it impacts you, both, politics-wise, economy-wise, and even what people are going to want and need at that time and in the future. And I think if you do that, you might be able to put yourself in a position that you can survive and possibly thrive.
Matt, can you, just before we pass it to Leland, can you remind us or remind me what was the site to subscribe to if you're interested in more of the macro conversation?
Yeah, so I say you start with the free YouTube channel to begin with to see that you like it, but there's a channel called Real Vision Television, I believe, and basically it's the world's best economists on there being interviewed. It's very, very good, and they also have a membership that's very affordable, where it's $200 a year, I believe, and you get stuff early, or you get some interviews that nobody else sees. And have found that extremely helpful in helping me find more clarity in the thinking of where things are going. Because I think if you understand things at a macro level, you can then figure out what's going to happen at a micro level. But it's very hard to do it the other way around. So it's useful.
Thanks. Thank you.
I think if you look at every major crisis that humanity has faced, and these include wars, they include major financial crises like the Great Depression and the Great Recession, and of course, pandemics such as this one. As horrible as they almost always result in innovations. So, innovations that you and I take for granted today, like the microwave oven and GPS technology, all came about as a result of weapons development during the Second World War. If you look at the innovations that resulted from the crash of 2008, things like Kickstarter and GoFundMe and Indiegogo wouldn't be around had it not been for those. So these, the one thing that we do know about major crises that face humanity is they almost always lead to innovation. So I'm not sure that there's massive differences in the ways in which small local firms will approach this and large multinationals. I think the successful ones will be the ones who innovate. I mean, we're already starting to see that, I think, at a very small, seemingly insignificant level with the way local restaurants, some of the good ones, or the efficient ones, are adapting to feeding people in their homes and doing a reasonable business out of it. A great example that I've been talking about in the last week or two is a business like a physical therapist or a physiotherapist. If you think about it, there's probably not a more physical business in the world, apart from having your hair cut, than a physical therapist. You need to be able to see them in their rooms. They need to work on you with their hands, their equipment, their ultrasound, and so forth. And so when this happens, you start to say, well, these people will close up. They won't be able to pay their rent, and they won't be able to pay their staff. Some of the really good ones have realized that it is just as efficient and just as effective to deliver physiotherapy, and found that in many cases, patients actually benefit more from it and appreciate it more. They get to talk and spend more time. There's no distractions. There's no need to drive to your appointment or to wait in a waiting room. It's in the comfort of your own home, and they feel they get far more personal attention, and can do exercises that would make up for the physical touch that they're not getting. So it can be done anywhere. And one last example is in my own field, which is education. Most universities sort of had a half-hearted attempt at online education. I think in most cases without great success. I'm not a huge fan of teaching online, but in March I was forced to, and I hate to admit it, but it really works well. I still prefer being in a real classroom, and I know that most students prefer being in a real classroom, but my goodness, this works. My great fear is that when and if this is over, universities are going to be saying, all right, let's go back to the normal that we used to do. And that, I think that is really silly, and it's wasting what's a big opportunity. If they were truly innovative, and sadly most of them are not, they would be designing whole new degree programs that could be delivered online. And instead of worrying about whether all your overseas students are going to make it for the fall semester, because that's where most of your funding comes from, instead of worrying about that, you could be providing education to the world. That, believe me, this is not going to happen. So I'm thinking wishfully here.
Yeah, Leila, I agree with you. I think there was a study, that looked at all the companies that actually made it like 100+ years, and I don't think there was one that ended up doing what they started out being, right? So the reality is you must innovate to survive if you want to make it a long time. And I also think that it's really interesting that these crises sometimes really challenge people's limiting beliefs, which is basically what you're kind of talking about, and that's the real blocker at the end of the day. I mean, this lesson just comes up for me personally over and over and over again. Very rarely do we have business problems, but we have mindset problems that show up in our business. And that's basically, what you're communicating is that we have these just limiting beliefs that's preventing us from this innovation. And if we can fix the mindset, then we can solve a lot of these problems. It's really interesting.